The flames danced against the starless Montana night, as Maribelle Nolan watched her life's work collapse into a fiery inferno. It wasn't the schoolhouse itself that made her heart pound with terror. It was the screams of the children trapped inside, their terrified voices cutting through the roar of the blaze that had engulfed the Chisholm Ranch schoolhouse on that fateful spring evening of 1876. Maribelle had stayed late that evening, a small group of children remaining behind for additional reading lessons. The lamp had been knocked over during a scuffle between two boys, and within moments, the dry timber of the schoolhouse was ablaze. At 24, the schoolteacher had never imagined making such a choice, but there was no choice at all, really. One by one, she shepherded the 5 children out through the narrow back window, her throat burning as she screamed instructions over the fire's hungry growl. The last child, little Emma Wilson, had frozen in terror. Maribelle had plunged back into the inferno, the scorching heat searing her lungs as she carried the 7-year-old to safety. By the time she collapsed on the grass outside, the damage was done. The children lived, but something precious had been taken from her, her voice. 3 months had passed since that night. The town had rebuilt the schoolhouse, but Maribelle's silence remained. Dr. Peterson had been kind, but blunt. The damage to her vocal cords was likely permanent. The smoke and heat had stolen what had once been her greatest asset as a teacher. Now, each morning, she woke to the same terrible silence, her thoughts trapped within her mind with no way to escape. The townspeople of Chisholm Ranch had been sympathetic at first. They'd brought food, offered condolences, called her a hero. But life in a frontier town moved forward relentlessly. The school board had reluctantly replaced her with a teacher from Helena who could actually speak to the children. Maribelle now worked at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, cooking and cleaning work that required no voice. She had learned to communicate through writing on a small slate she carried everywhere, but it was a poor substitute for the easy conversation she once took for granted. Some folks avoided her gaze now, uncomfortable with her silence as if her muteness were contagious. Children who had once loved her lessons now regarded her with a mixture of pity and fear. At night, she would silently cry herself to sleep, mourning not just her voice but her purpose. On a warm June morning, as she swept the porch of the boarding house, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of riders. Chisholm Ranch rarely saw new faces outside the regular stagecoach schedule, so Maribelle paused, leaning on her broom to watch their approach. 3 riders came into view, their horses moving at an easy canter. 2 were clearly ranch hands, dusty and weathered. But it was the 3rd rider who caught Maribelle's attention, tall and straight-backed in the saddle, his dark hat pulled low against the sun, a confident ease to his posture that suggested he was accustomed to long days on horseback. Mrs. Holloway bustled out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "That'll be the Quinn boy," she said. "Word is he's bought the old Hargrove place, bringing cattle up from Texas, or some such notion." Maribelle nodded, though her employer wasn't looking for a response. She'd heard rumors of the ranch changing hands, but paid little attention to such matters. Her world had contracted to the boarding house and the small room above it that she now called home. The riders drew closer, and Maribelle turned to go back inside. Newcomers meant questions she couldn't answer, explanations she couldn't give. But Mrs. Holloway's hand on her arm stopped her. "Stay put, girl. If he's taking rooms here, you'll need to know his preferences." The riders reined in before the boarding house, dust settling around them. The man in front removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair and a face tanned by sun and weather. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose looked to have been broken at least once, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, but there was a steadiness in his gaze that Maribel found herself responding to. "Madam," he said, nodding to Mrs. Holloway, "I'm looking for accommodations." "Name's Kieran Quinn. I understand you run the only boarding house in town." "That we do, Mr. Quinn. Got 2 rooms available, both with good beds and clean linens. Breakfast and supper included in the rate." As the two discussed terms, Kieran Quinn's gaze shifted to Maribel. She felt herself flush under his scrutiny and dropped her eyes to the porch floorboards. "And this is," he asked. "My help," Mrs. Holloway said. "Maribelle Nolan. She don't speak, poor thing. Lost her voice in the schoolhouse fire this past spring. Saved 5 children, she did." Maribel flinched at the casual revelation of her tragedy. She didn't need or want anyone's pity, least of all a stranger's. But when she risked a glance upward, she saw no pity in Kieran Quinn's eyes. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like respect. "Miss Nolan," he said, tipping his hat to her. The gesture was so natural, so devoid of the awkwardness that usually accompanied interactions with her now, that Maribel found herself smiling slightly in return. "I'll take the rooms," he said to Mrs. Holloway, though his eyes lingered on Maribel for a moment longer. "For myself and my foreman, Mr. Brooks. We'll be in town for some time, getting the ranch operational." "Very good, Mr. Quinn. Maribel, show these gentlemen to rooms 3 and 4, if you please." Maribel nodded and gestured for the men to follow her inside. As she led them up the narrow staircase, she was acutely aware of Kieran Quinn behind her, his spurs making a gentle jingling sound with each step. At the top of the stairs, she pointed to the 2 rooms at the end of the hallway, then reached for the small slate and chalk she kept tied at her waist. Quickly, she wrote, "Supper at 6, washroom down the hall." Kieran Quinn read the slate, then looked up at her face. "Thank you, Miss Nolan," he said. Something in his voice made her believe he meant it. Over the next few days, Maribel found herself increasingly aware of the new boarder. Unlike most men who came through Chisholm Ranch, Kieran Quinn was unfailingly polite, not just to Mrs. Holloway but to Maribel as well. He said please and thank you when she served his meals, and unlike some of the other boarders, he never treated her silence as a reason to talk around her or ignore her presence. A week after his arrival, she was in the kitchen garden, harvesting beans for the evening meal, when a shadow fell across the row she was working. Looking up, she found Kieran Quinn standing at the garden gate, hat in hand. "Miss Nolan," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Maribel shook her head and reached for her slate, but he raised a hand to stop her. "No need for that just yet," he said. "I actually have something to ask you, and I think a simple yes or no will suffice." Intrigued, she set down her basket and gave him her full attention. "I understand you were the schoolteacher here before the fire," he said. Maribel nodded, her chest tightening at the reminder. "And I'd wager you were a good one," he continued. "The thing is, Miss Nolan, I never had much schooling myself. Grew up working cattle with my pa from the time I could sit a horse. But now I've got ledgers to keep and contracts to read, and I find myself lacking." He looked uncomfortable with the admission, but pressed on. "I'm looking for someone to help me improve my reading and figuring. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you might be willing to tutor me in the evenings after your work is done." Maribel blinked in surprise. Of all the things she might have expected from the confident cattleman, this request wasn't one of them. She reached for her slate and quickly wrote, "I can help, but how will I teach without a voice?" Kieran read her words and smiled a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "I reckon there's more than one way to teach a man, Miss Nolan. I don't need fancy speeches. I just need someone patient enough to show me what I don't know." After a moment's consideration, Maribelle nodded and wrote, "Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. Bring a book." The next evening found them in the boarding house parlor, Mrs. Holloway having granted permission for the lessons with a knowing smile that made Maribelle blush. Kieran arrived promptly at 7, carrying a worn copy of Gulliver's Travels and a small leather-bound notebook. "My mother's book," he explained, seeing Maribelle's interest in the volume. "One of the few things of hers I still have." For 2 hours, they sat at the small table by the window. Kieran's reading skills were better than he had let on. He could read most words but struggled with longer passages and complex vocabulary. His handwriting was rough but serviceable. What impressed Maribelle most was his determination. When he stumbled over a word or phrase, he didn't give up but worked at it until he conquered it. As the days stretched into weeks, their evening lessons became a comfortable routine. Maribelle found herself looking forward to them, preparing exercises and passages during her quiet moments at the boarding house. Kieran proved to be an apt pupil, his natural intelligence making up for his lack of formal education. One evening, as July heat pressed against the windows and cicadas droned outside, Kieran arrived for his lesson looking unusually thoughtful. "Miss Nolan," he said, setting his book on the table, "I've been thinking about something." Maribelle tilted her head questioningly. "You and I have been working together for nearly a month now, but it occurs to me our communication is rather one-sided. You read my efforts and correct my mistakes, but I've given you no way to speak to me except through writing." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small book. "I found this in Helena last week when I was there on business. It's about hand signs, the kind used by the Plains Indians to communicate between tribes with different languages. I thought perhaps we might learn it together, give you another way to express yourself." Maribelle took the book with trembling hands. No one since the fire had thought about her silence as anything but a tragedy to be pitied or an inconvenience to be worked around. No one had considered that she might want more ways to communicate. She opened the book to find detailed illustrations of hand gestures with their meanings written alongside. Looking up at Kieran, she saw uncertainty in his expression, as if he feared he had overstepped. Impulsively, she reached out and squeezed his hand. Then she took her slate and wrote, "Yes. I would like that very much." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the Montana plains. The sign language book changed everything. Their evening sessions now included time spent practicing the signs together, both of them laughing at their clumsy initial attempts. Maribelle, who had always been quick to learn, picked up the signs rapidly. Kieran was slower but no less determined. Within 2 weeks, they had mastered enough basic signs to hold simple conversations without Maribelle's slate. The first time she signed "thank you" to him after he poured her tea, and he understood without hesitation. The joy that flooded through her was almost painful in its intensity. As August ripened the wheat fields around Chisholm Ranch, Maribelle found herself watching for Kieran throughout her days. She noticed the way the corner of his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful precision with which he handled her books, the gentle way he spoke to Mrs. Holloway's ancient cat. When he was away at his ranch for 2 days, overseeing the delivery of new cattle, she felt his absence like a physical thing. It was Mrs. Holloway who finally said what Maribelle hadn't admitted to herself. "That young man is sweet on you, girl," she said one morning as they kneaded bread together. "And unless I miss my guess, the feeling's mutual." Maribelle's hands stilled in the dough. She shook her head firmly, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. "Don't you shake your head at me, Maribelle Nolan. I've been around long enough to know what I'm seeing. The way he looks at you isn't the way a man looks at his teacher." Maribelle picked up her slate and wrote, "He feels sorry for me." Mrs. Holloway snorted. That man doesn't strike me as the type to spend his evenings with someone out of pity. Besides, the way you light up when he walks into a room tells its own story. Maribel had no response to that truth. That evening, when Kieran arrived for their lesson, she found herself noticing things she had been trying to ignore: the clean scent of soap that clung to him, the way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders, the warmth in his eyes when they settled on her. They worked through a passage about cattle breeding practices, which Kieran had brought from his ranch. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, watching as she carefully closed the book. "Miss Nolan," he said, then hesitated. "Maribel, I was wondering if you might accompany me to the Founders' Day celebration this Saturday." As my companion, Maribel's heart skipped. The annual celebration was Chisholm Ranch's biggest social event, with a picnic, dancing, and games. Before the fire, she had attended as the schoolteacher, helping to organize activities for the children. She hadn't planned to go this year. Large gatherings had become uncomfortable, filled with pitying glances and awkward attempts at conversation. She reached for her slate, but Kieran touched her hand, stopping her. "Could you give me your answer with signs?" he asked softly. "I've been practicing." Maribel felt a rush of gratitude and something warmer. Slowly, her hands formed the signs they had been learning together. "I would like that." His answering smile was worth any discomfort the celebration might bring. Saturday dawned clear and bright. Maribel dressed with unusual care in her best blue calico dress, her hair arranged in a simple but becoming style. When Kieran arrived at the boarding house to escort her, he was similarly transformed: his usual working clothes replaced by a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and polished boots. "You look lovely," he said, offering his arm. The celebration was held in the town square, which had been decorated with bunting and paper lanterns for the occasion. As they approached, Maribel felt a familiar anxiety rise within her. The last time she had been among so many of the townspeople had been at the dedication of the new schoolhouse, an event that had left her feeling more isolated than ever. Kieran seemed to sense her hesitation. "We don't have to stay long," he assured her. "Just long enough to pay our respects to the mayor and sample Mrs. Peterson's apple pie, which I'm told is not to be missed." His easy manner calmed her, and she nodded, tightening her grip on his arm. They were barely through the square's entrance when they were approached by Mayor Wilson and his wife, whose daughter Emma had been the last child Maribel saved from the fire. "Miss Nolan," the mayor said warmly, "how good to see you out and about. And Mr. Quinn, I understand your cattle operation is coming along nicely." As the men exchanged pleasantries about ranching and beef prices, Mrs. Wilson touched Maribel's arm. "We've never properly thanked you," she said softly, "for Emma. She still has nightmares sometimes, but she's alive because of you. We're forever grateful." Before Maribel could reach for her slate, Kieran spoke up. "Maribel says she's glad Emma is doing well," he said, accurately interpreting the simple signs Maribel had made. "She thinks of the children often." Mrs. Wilson looked startled, then pleased. "You can understand her hands. We've been learning together," Kieran said, with a warmth in his voice that made Maribel's cheeks flush. As they moved through the celebration, Kieran continued to serve as her interpreter when needed, though many conversations were conducted through her slate. What amazed Maribel was how naturally he did it, not speaking for her, but with her, including her in every discussion as an equal participant. By the time they reached the dance area, where a small band was playing lively tunes, Maribel felt more at ease than she had in any social gathering since the fire. When Kieran asked her to dance with a formal bow that made her smile, she hesitated only briefly before accepting. "I should warn you," he said as he led her onto the makeshift dance floor. "I'm not much of a dancer. Cattle don't care much for fancy footwork." But his arm was steady around her waist, and he moved with the same natural grace he showed on horseback. As they twirled among the other couples, Maribel felt a lightness she had forgotten was possible. For those few minutes, she wasn't the mute ex-schoolteacher who lived in the shadows. She was simply a young woman dancing with a handsome man on a beautiful summer evening. Later, as the sun began to set, and the paper lanterns glowed against the deepening blue of the sky, they sat on a bench at the edge of the square, sharing a plate of Mrs. Peterson's apple pie, which was, indeed, not to be missed. "I have something I want to ask you," Kieran said, setting the empty plate aside. Maribel looked at him expectantly. "I've been thinking a lot about our lessons," he began. "About how much I've learned from you, not just about reading and writing, but about perseverance, courage." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "The ranch is nearly operational now. I've got good men working for me, but what I don't have is someone to help me manage the books, keep records, handle correspondence." He turned to face her directly. "I'd like to offer you a position, Maribel, as the ranch's manager of accounts. The pay would be better than what you earn at the boarding house, and you'd have your own cabin on the property. Most importantly, you'd be using your education again." Maribel stared at him, stunned by the offer. It was so unexpected, so perfectly aligned with the skills she thought had become useless to her, that for a moment she couldn't respond. Kieran misinterpreted her silence. "I understand if you're not interested." "It was just a thought," she cut him off by placing her hand over his, then quickly signed. "Why me?" He didn't hesitate. "Because you're the smartest person I know. Because you've shown more strength in the face of adversity than anyone I've ever met. Because the work I'm offering is important to me, and I trust you to do it well." His expression softened. "And because I enjoy your company, Maribelle Nolan, more than I've enjoyed anyone's in a very long time." In that moment, with the music playing softly behind them and the stars beginning to emerge overhead, Maribel made a decision. She had spent 3 months mourning what she had lost. Perhaps it was time to discover what she might gain. She signed slowly and deliberately. "Yes, I accept." 2 weeks later, Maribel moved to the Quinn ranch. Mrs. Holloway had been sad to see her go but understood the opportunity it represented. "Just don't be a stranger," she'd said, wrapping Maribel in a rare embrace. "And tell that young man of yours if he doesn't treat you right, he'll answer to me." The ranch was 7 miles outside of town, a sprawling property nestled against the foothills with a clear creek running through its heart. The main house was modest but solid, built of local timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Behind it stood a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a barn and several corrals. And set slightly apart, near a stand of cottonwoods, was the cabin Kieran had promised her, a small but charming structure with 2 rooms, its own garden patch, and a view of both the mountains and the ranch house. It was the original homesteader's cabin, Kieran explained as he carried her trunk inside. "I've had the men fixing it up these past weeks. New roof, fresh plaster, sturdier windows. I hope it suits you." Maribel walked through the cabin in wonder. The main room held a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the window, and shelves already stocked with essentials. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand, and a wardrobe. Someone Kieran, she suspected, had placed a vase of wildflowers on the bedside table. She turned to him, hands moving quickly. "It's perfect. Thank you." He smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Mrs. Brooks, my foreman's wife, lives at the ranch too. She said to tell you she's looking forward to having another woman about the place." She'll help you settle in." That evening, after Kieran left her to unpack, Maribelle sat in the rocking chair by her new window, watching as the ranch settled for the night. Lamps were lit in the bunkhouse, and she could hear the distant sound of a harmonica. From the main house, smoke curled from the chimney against the darkening sky. For the first time since the fire, she felt a sense of possibility unfurling within her. This wasn't the life she had planned teaching children in the schoolhouse she had loved, but perhaps it could be a good life nonetheless. The next morning, Kieran showed her to the small office he had set up for her in a corner of the main house. It was a bright room with windows on two sides, furnished with a solid desk, a comfortable chair, and shelves for ledgers and papers. "I'm afraid it's a bit of a mess," he said, gesturing to the stacks of papers piled haphazardly on the desk. "I've been keeping records as best I can, but—" Maribelle suppressed a smile as she surveyed the chaos. She had her work cut out for her. Over the next few days, she immersed herself in bringing order to the ranch's accounts. Kieran had been running the operation on instinct and basic arithmetic, which had worked well enough while the ranch was getting established, but wouldn't sustain a growing business. She created proper ledgers, organized receipts, drafted a system for tracking expenses and income, and began a correspondence file. Kieran watched her transformation of his paperwork with undisguised admiration. "I knew you were the right person for this job," he said on the third day, as she showed him the newly organized filing system. "I just didn't realize how right." Working together each day, their relationship shifted subtly. The formal Miss Nolan disappeared entirely, replaced by Maribelle spoken in tones that grew increasingly warm. Their sign language continued to improve, and they developed shorthand signs specific to ranch operations, quick gestures for cattle, pasture, market prices, and other frequently discussed topics. As September painted the cottonwoods gold, Maribelle found herself settling into a rhythm at the ranch. Each morning, she would tend her small garden, then walk to the main house where Mrs. Brooks, a cheerful, plump woman with grown children back east, would have coffee waiting. She would spend the day in her office, interrupted occasionally by Kieran or Mr. Brooks with questions or updates. In the evenings, she often stayed for supper in the main house, a casual affair where ranch business was discussed alongside stories and jokes. Afterward, if the weather was fine, she and Kieran would sometimes sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge while they talked with his voice, she with her hands about books, the day's events, or their childhoods. Kieran, she learned, had lost his mother to fever when he was 12, after which his father had moved them constantly, following work across Texas and the territories. He had grown up on horseback, learning the cattle business from the ground up, saving every penny toward his dream of his own ranch. "My father didn't live to see it," he told her one evening. "He died 2 years ago, kicked by a horse he was breaking. His last words to me were to stop dreaming and start doing." He smiled faintly. "So that's what I did. Took everything I had and bought this place. Sometimes I think he'd be proud. Other times, I'm sure he'd tell me I'm doing it all wrong." Maribelle signed that she understood. Her own father, a circuit judge, had wanted her to marry well, not become a frontier schoolteacher. He had died disapproving of her choices, never knowing she had found fulfillment in the classroom. "And now," Kieran asked softly, "after everything that's happened, do you regret coming west?" She considered the question carefully, her hands moving slowly as she signed her answer. "No. If I had stayed in Boston, I would never have known what I was capable of. I would never have saved those children. I would never have met you." The last admission slipped out before she could stop it. In the lantern light, she saw Kieran's eyes darken with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. "Maribelle," he began, but she stood abruptly, signing that it was late and she should return to her cabin. He didn't press, merely nodded and offered to walk her home. They crossed the yard in silence, the only sounds the chirp of crickets and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant pastures. At her door, she signed a quick good night, but as she turned to go inside, Kieran caught her hand. "You've brought something to this ranch that was missing," he said quietly. "Something I didn't even know I needed until you were here. I just wanted you to know that." Before she could respond, he released her hand and walked away, his figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. That night, Maribelle lay awake long after she should have been asleep, replaying his words in her mind. She had come to the ranch believing she was starting over, rebuilding a life that had been shattered by fire. What she hadn't expected was to find pieces of herself she thought were gone forever, not just her professional capabilities, but her capacity for joy, for connection, for love. The realization that she was falling in love with Kieran Quinn didn't strike her like lightning, it settled over her like dawn breaking, a gradual illumination of something that had been developing in the shadows for weeks. And with that realization came fear. What kind of future could there be for a woman who couldn't speak, and a man whose life was built on the hard, practical work of a ranch? What would happen when the novelty of their hand-signed conversations wore thin, when he tired of her silence? The next morning, Maribelle awoke to the sound of raised voices. Peering through her window, she saw a group of riders approaching the main house, strangers, not ranch hands. Quickly dressing, she hurried across the yard. Kieran stood on the porch, his stance tense as he faced the newcomers. Mr. Brooks was beside him, one hand resting near the gun at his hip. "I've told you before, Jenkins," Kieran was saying as Maribelle approached. "This water rights dispute will be settled by the territorial court, not by threats." The leader of the group, a bull-necked man with a florid face, spat into the dust. "Courts take too long, Quinn. My cattle are dying of thirst now. You're diverting more than your share from the creek, and everybody knows it." "I'm taking exactly what I'm entitled to under the law," Kieran said evenly. "No more, no less. If your cattle are dying, perhaps you should look to your own management practices." Jenkins's face darkened. "You think you can come up here from Texas and tell us how to run our ranches? This valley belonged to Montana men before you showed up." "The deed in my safe says differently," Kieran replied. "Now, I suggest you and your men ride on. This conversation is finished." For a tense moment, it seemed Jenkins might escalate the confrontation. But after a hard stare, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Quinn, not by a long shot." As the riders departed, Kieran noticed Maribelle standing at the edge of the porch. The grim expression on his face softened. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said. She signed. "What's happening?" "Who were those men?" Kieran sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jasper Jenkins owns the neighboring ranch to the north. There's a dispute over water rights. He claims I'm taking more than my share from Willow Creek, which runs through both our properties. The truth is, his ranch is poorly managed, and he's looking for someone to blame for his problems." "Is it dangerous?" she asked, her hands betraying her concern. "Jenkins is all bluster," Kieran assured her. "He likes to throw his weight around, but he knows the law isn't on his side. The territorial court will settle it next month when the judge comes through." Despite his reassurances, Maribelle noticed that Kieran posted extra men on watch that night, and for several nights after. The confrontation cast a shadow over the ranch, a reminder that their peaceful existence was more fragile than it had seemed. A week passed without further incident, and the routine of ranch life reasserted itself. Maribelle was in her office one afternoon, working on correspondence, when Kieran appeared in the doorway. I need to ride to Helena tomorrow, he said. There are contracts to sign with the cattle buyer, and I want to check on the court date for the water dispute. I was wondering if you might like to come along. It would be a chance to see the territorial capital, and I could use your eye on the contracts. The invitation surprised her. Helena was a 2-day journey each way, which meant at least 5 days away from the ranch. She hesitated, then signed. Who will handle things here? Brooks is more than capable, Kieran assured her. And to be honest, after Jenkins's visit, I'd feel better having you with me than leaving you here. The admission that he worried for her safety touched Maribelle deeply. She nodded her acceptance. They set out at dawn the next morning, riding side by side along the trail that led toward the territorial capital. Maribelle, who had grown up riding in Boston's parks but had little experience with long journeys on horseback, found the first day challenging but exhilarating. The vast Montana landscape unfolded around them, rolling prairies giving way to pine-covered hills, the distant mountains a purple smudge against the horizon. Kieran was a considerate traveling companion, setting a pace that wouldn't overtax her and finding scenic spots for their brief rests. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks and told her stories of the region's history, some learned from books, others from the old-timers he'd met since moving to Montana. By late afternoon, they had reached the small settlement of Elk Crossing, where Kieran had arranged for them to spend the night. The town's only inn was a rough establishment that catered primarily to miners and freighters, but the proprietor showed them to clean, if sparse, rooms and promised a hot meal. After washing away the dust of the trail, Maribelle met Kieran in the inn's dining room. The few other patrons, all men, glanced at them with undisguised curiosity as they took their seats at a corner table. "Ignore them," Kieran said quietly. "It's not often they see a lady in these parts." The meal was simple but filling: venison stew, fresh bread, and apple cobbler for dessert. As they ate, Maribelle noticed Kieran watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "What is it?" she signed. He smiled slightly. "I was just thinking how different you look outside the ranch, more alive somehow." She raised an eyebrow, not sure whether to be flattered or offended. "That came out wrong," he said, shaking his head. "What I mean is, when you first came to Chisholm Ranch, there was a sadness about you, understandably so. But out here, away from the reminders of what happened, you seem freer. Your eyes are brighter." Maribelle considered his words, then signed. "Perhaps it's not the place, but the company." The admission hung between them, changing the air like the first hint of thunder before a storm. Kieran's eyes darkened, and he leaned slightly forward. "Maribelle," he began, but was interrupted by the arrival of the innkeeper with coffee. By the time they were alone again, the moment had passed, and their conversation shifted to safer topics: the contracts they would review in Helena, the supplies they needed to purchase for the ranch. Later, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the inn, Maribelle reflected on the day's journey. There had been a freedom in the hours on the trail with Kieran, away from the ranch, away from Chisholm Ranch and its memories, away from the daily reminders of all she had lost. On horseback, with the wind in her hair and Kieran's steady presence beside her, her silence had felt less like a burden and more like a simple fact of her existence, no more defining than the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. They reached Helena late the following day. The territorial capital was larger and more developed than Maribelle had expected, with substantial buildings of brick and stone lining the main streets. Kieran took her to the International Hotel, a 3-story establishment that represented frontier luxury. "We'll be here for 3 days, he told her as a porter carried their bags inside. "I have meetings tomorrow and the next day. The day after, We can explore the city a bit before heading back." Helena proved to be a revelation to Maribel. After months in the small community of Chisholm Ranch, the bustle and variety of the territorial capital were both overwhelming and exciting. While Kieran attended to his business meetings, she explored the shops along Main Street, purchasing small luxuries that were unavailable at the ranch: good writing paper, a bottle of lavender water, a book of poetry. On their final day in the city, Kieran took her to the Territorial Library, a modest but well-stocked institution that made her heart ache with memories of the books she had once shared with her students. Seeing her expression as she ran her fingers along the spines, Kieran quietly arranged with the librarian for Maribel to borrow several volumes to take back to the ranch. That evening, they dined in the hotel's restaurant, a formal affair that required Maribel to wear the one good dress she had brought along. As they were finishing their meal, a string quartet set up in the corner of the dining room and began to play. Kieran glanced at the small dance floor where several couples were already gathering, then back at Maribel. "Would you care to dance?" he asked. In the soft lamplight of the restaurant, with the music swelling around them, Maribel felt a rush of longing for a life she had once taken for granted, a life where such simple pleasures were commonplace rather than rare exceptions. She nodded, setting aside her napkin. Kieran led her to the dance floor and drew her into his arms with a confidence that surprised her. As they moved together to the waltz, she realized he had been modest about his dancing abilities, or perhaps he had been practicing since the Founders' Day celebration. "I've been thinking," he said as they turned among the other couples, "about what happens when we return to the ranch." Maribel looked up at him questioningly. "These past few days have been different," he continued, "being away from the ranch, just the two of us." "I've enjoyed it more than I can say." She nodded, indicating she had felt the same. "The thing is, Maribel, I find myself thinking about you constantly, when we're working together, when we're apart, even when I should be focusing on business negotiations." His smile was rueful. "I nearly agreed to a ridiculous price for winter feed yesterday, because I was wondering what you were doing instead of listening to the supplier." The waltz ended, but Kieran kept hold of her hand as they left the dance floor, leading her to a quiet corner of the restaurant where they could speak and sign more privately. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly," he continued, "is that my feelings for you have become more than those of an employer for an employee, more than those of a friend even." Maribel's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. She withdrew her hand from his to sign. "I feel the same." Relief and joy washed over his face. "I wasn't sure," he admitted. "You're so composed, so self-contained. Sometimes I feel like I can read your thoughts perfectly, and other times you're a complete mystery to me." She smiled at that, then sighed. "But my situation makes things complicated. I'm not whole." Kieran's expression grew serious. "Don't ever think that," he said firmly. "Your voice was just one part of who you are, Maribel. Its absence doesn't diminish your intelligence, your courage, your compassion, all the things that make you the woman I've come to care for deeply." Tears welled in Maribel's eyes at his words. She had spent so many months seeing herself as broken, damaged. To have Kieran see her as complete was overwhelming. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. In answer, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as his arms came around her, drawing her close. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. She sighed. "Why did you wait so long?" "I wasn't sure you were ready. After everything you've been through, I didn't want to rush you." His consideration touched her deeply. In a world that often saw her silence as a reason to dismiss or pity her, Kieran consistently treated her with a respect that acknowledged both her strength and her vulnerability. They returned to the ranch 3 days later, both acutely aware that something fundamental had changed between them. Maribelle moved back into her cabin, and Kieran to the main house, but the distance felt artificial now, a concession to propriety rather than a reflection of their feelings. Their days fell into a new rhythm. They worked together as before, but now there were shared glances, brief touches, private moments stolen between the demands of the ranch. In the evenings, they would often walk along the creek, talking of the future in ways that gradually became more specific, more shared. 2 weeks after their return from Helena, Kieran rode into Chisholm Ranch to collect mail and supplies. When he returned, he brought news that cast a shadow over their newfound happiness. "The judge has postponed his circuit," he told Maribelle as they sat on the porch of the main house. "The water rights case won't be heard for at least another 2 months." She frowned, signing. "Will that cause problems with Jenkins?" "It might," Kieran admitted. "He's been losing cattle and he's convinced it's because I'm taking more than my share of water. The longer this drags on, the more desperate he'll become." As if his words were prophetic, trouble arrived 3 days later. Maribelle was working in her garden when she heard shouting from the direction of the creek. Setting down her trowel, she hurried toward the sound. Kieran and Mr. Brooks stood at the edge of the water, facing Jenkins and 4 of his men. All were on horseback and all looked angry. "You're trespassing, Jenkins," Kieran was saying as Maribelle approached. "This is my land and you have no right to be here." "I have every right to see what you've done to the creek," Jenkins retorted. "Look at it, barely flowing, and I suppose it's just a coincidence that the water level drops right after it passes through your property." "The creek is low because we've had a dry summer," Kieran said evenly. "I haven't altered the flow in any way," Jenkins sneered. "That's not what my men tell me. They've seen your hands building something upstream, a dam, most likely." "We've been reinforcing the banks to prevent erosion," Kieran explained, though his patience was clearly wearing thin. "There's no dam. If you'd waited for the judge's ruling instead of trespassing, you could have had an official survey done." "I'm tired of waiting on judges and lawyers," Jenkins spat. "My cattle need water now." Maribelle, watching from the edge of the clearing, saw the moment when Jenkins's gaze shifted to her. Something ugly crossed his face. "Well, well," he said. "If it isn't the mute schoolteacher, I heard Quinn had taken you in. Charitable of him." Kieran's expression hardened. "You're speaking about the manager of my accounts and my fiancée, Jenkins. I suggest you mind your tone." "Fiancée." The word sent a shock through Maribelle. They had spoken of a future together, but not in such specific terms. Jenkins laughed harshly. "Fiancé? Is that what you call it? I suppose she doesn't complain much, does she?" "Can't." Mr. Brooks stepped forward, his hand dropping to his gun. "That's enough, Jenkins. Get off this land before I remove you myself." For a tense moment, it seemed Jenkins might push the confrontation further, but after a hard stare, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Quinn. Not by a long shot." As the riders departed, Kieran finally noticed Maribelle standing at the edge of the clearing. The anger on his face gave way to concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, crossing to her. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," she signed. "Fiancé," a flush crept up his neck. "I apologize for that, too. It just came out in the heat of the moment. Not that I haven't been thinking about us in those terms, but I should have spoken to you first." Mr. Brooks, watching their exchange with barely concealed amusement, cleared his throat. "I'll just go make sure those fellows actually leave the property," he said, mounting his horse and riding off after Jenkins and his men. When they were alone, Kieran took Maribelle's hands in his. "I had planned to do this properly," he said. Not blurted out during an argument with a water-stealing neighbor. She raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile playing around her lips. "Maribelle Nolan," he said, his voice dropping to a softer register. "These past months have shown me what it means to truly connect with someone, not just through words, but through understanding, through shared purpose, through love." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I love you. And if you'll have me, I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Maribel's heart felt too full for her chest. She had come to the ranch believing she was starting over, rebuilding what she could of a shattered life. She had never expected to find something better than what she had lost: a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding, a love that saw her silence not as a flaw but simply as a part of who she was. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, forming the signs they had learned together. "Yes, I will marry you." Kieran's face lit with a joy that mirrored her own. He drew her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all that was to come. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations and planning. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch and into Chisholm Ranch. Mrs. Holloway arrived with a basket of preserves and a tearful embrace for Maribel. "I knew that boy was sweet on you from the start," she declared triumphantly. They decided on a small ceremony in November, after the fall cattle drive was complete. Maribel wrote to her mother and sister in Boston, inviting them to make the journey west for the wedding, though she wasn't sure they would undertake such a long trip. In the midst of their happiness, however, the conflict with Jenkins continued to simmer. Twice more his men were spotted on Quinn land, ostensibly checking the creek, but clearly seeking evidence of water diversion. Kieran posted more guards and wrote another letter to the territorial judge, urging a speedy resolution to the dispute. "He's getting desperate," Kieran told Maribel one evening as they sat before the fire in the main house. "His cattle are suffering from poor management and overgrazing, not lack of water. But he needs someone to blame, and we're the convenient target." Maribel signed her concern. "Could he become dangerous?" Kieran hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible. Men like Jenkins, when they're backed into a corner, sometimes lash out. That's why I've asked the men to be vigilant and why I want you to be careful, especially when I'm not here." Her brow furrowed. "Are you going somewhere?" "Just to Chisholm Ranch for a day or two," he assured her. "The cattle buyer is coming through, and I need to finalize the arrangements for the drive. Brooks will be here, and I'll leave extra men at the ranch." Despite his precautions, Maribel felt uneasy as she watched Kieran ride out the next morning. The ranch felt emptier without him, the shadows deeper, the sounds of the night more ominous. She spent the day in her office, catching up on correspondence and reviewing the book's work that usually absorbed her completely, but now failed to distract her from a growing sense of foreboding. By late afternoon, a headache was building behind her eyes, and she decided to return to her cabin for a rest before supper. The path to her cabin took her past the creek, where the water flowed clear and swift over moss-covered stones. She paused, watching the play of late afternoon sunlight on the surface, feeling some of her tension ease at the peaceful scene. The crack of a twig behind her was her only warning. Before she could turn, rough hands seized her arms, and a cloth was pressed over her mouth and nose. She struggled, but the sweet, chemical smell overwhelmed her senses, and darkness closed in when Maribel regained consciousness. She was in a moving wagon, her hands bound before her. Night had fallen, and the air was cold against her skin. She tried to sit up, fighting a wave of nausea from whatever had been used to render her unconscious. "She's awake," a voice said, not Jenkins, but one of his men. A lantern was raised, illuminating Jenkins's face as he leaned over the side of the wagon to look at her. "Good evening, Miss Nolan," he said, his tone mockingly polite. "I apologize for the rough handling, but I needed Quinn's attention, and you seemed the most efficient way to get it." Maribelle glared at him, tugging futilely at the ropes around her wrists. "Don't bother," Jenkins said. "You're not going anywhere until Quinn agrees to my terms. He wants you back. He gives me access to the upper creek. Simple as that." She shook her head vehemently. Kieran would never agree to such terms, not because she wasn't worth it to him, but because he knew as well as she did that giving in to Jenkins's demands would only encourage more such behavior in the future. Jenkins shrugged. "We'll see. In the meantime, you'll be our guest at my ranch. It's not as fancy as Quinn's place, but it'll do for a few days." A few days. Kieran wouldn't be back from Chisholm Ranch until tomorrow at the earliest. By the time he realized she was missing and traced her to Jenkins's ranch, who knew what might happen? The wagon rumbled on through the night, eventually turning onto a rutted track that led to a cluster of buildings, Jenkins's ranch house and outbuildings. Unlike the well-maintained Quinn Ranch, these structures showed signs of neglect: peeling paint, sagging porches, broken fences. "Home sweet home," Jenkins said as the wagon stopped before the main house. "Get her inside," he ordered his men. "And make sure she can't escape. She may be mute, but she's not stupid." Maribelle was half dragged, half carried into the house and up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom at the back. The room was sparsely furnished: a bed, a chair, a washstand, and the window had been nailed shut. "You'll stay here until Quinn comes for you," Jenkins told her. "There'll be a guard outside the door at all times. Don't get any ideas about escaping." He paused, then added with a sneer, "Not that you could call for help anyway." The door closed behind him with a heavy finality, and Maribelle heard the key turn in the lock. Alone, she sank onto the edge of the bed, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. "Think," she told herself firmly. "Kieran will come, but he won't know where to look right away. You need to help yourself." She examined the room carefully in the dim light of the single lamp Jenkins's men had left. The window, though nailed shut, offered a view of the ranch yard and the hills beyond. If she could somehow signal from that window. But what kind of signal could she send that would be visible from a distance? She had no matches to start a fire, nothing reflective to catch the sun. Then her gaze fell on the quilt covering the bed, a simple pattern of alternating light and dark squares. An idea began to form. At the Quinn Ranch, Mr. Brooks was the first to realize something was wrong. When Maribelle failed to appear for supper, he sent one of the hands to check her cabin. Finding it empty, with her afternoon work abandoned on the table, he organized a search of the ranch grounds. It was a young cowhand named Tyler who found the signs of struggle by the creek: disturbed earth, broken branches, and most ominously, Maribelle's slate lying in the grass. "Jenkins," Brooks said grimly when he saw the evidence. "This has his stink all over it." He dispatched a rider to Chisholm Ranch immediately to fetch Kieran, then gathered the remaining hands. "We're not waiting," he told them. "Miss Nolan is in danger and every hour counts. Get your guns and extra ammunition. We're riding to Jenkins's place." It was nearly midnight when Kieran thundered into the ranch yard, his horse lathered from the hard ride from town. The messenger had found him at the hotel, and he had left immediately, pushing his mount to its limits. "What do we know?" he demanded as he swung down from the saddle. "Not much," Brooks admitted. "She disappeared sometime late yesterday afternoon. We found signs of a struggle by the creek. Most of the hands are already on their way to Jenkins's ranch, but I waited for you." Kieran's face was a mask of controlled fury. "If he's harmed her, we'll get her back," Brooks assured him. And Jenkins will regret the day he decided to make this personal. As dawn broke over the Montana hills, Maribelle stood at the window of her prison, the quilt from the bed draped over the sill. Slowly, methodically, she raised and lowered it, creating a pattern of movement that she hoped might catch the eye of anyone watching from the surrounding hills. She had spent hours the previous day observing the routine of the ranch, noting when guards changed and how many men Jenkins had at his disposal. There were fewer than at the Quinn ranch, perhaps 10 in total, many of them looking more like drifters than professional cowhands. Jenkins himself had visited her room once, bringing a tray of food and informing her that a message had been sent to Quinn. "He should be here by nightfall," he had said with satisfaction. "And then we'll see how much he values his water rights against your safety." Maribelle had glared at him, wishing desperately for her slate to communicate her contempt. But perhaps her silence was more unnerving. Jenkins had left quickly, muttering something about unnatural women. Now, as she continued her signaling, she caught a flash of movement on the hill overlooking the ranch. Squinting against the early morning light, she made out the silhouette of a rider too far away to identify, but definitely watching the ranch house. Hope surged through her. Kieran had found her. But how would he get past Jenkins's men? Her answer came an hour later, as a wagon rumbled into the ranch yard. From her window, Maribelle could see it was loaded with barrels, supplies, perhaps, or water for the ranch. The driver wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his face. As Jenkins's men gathered around the wagon, the driver suddenly stood up, revealing a familiar face, not Kieran, but Mr. Brooks. In the same moment, shots rang out from the surrounding hills, and men seemed to materialize from behind every building and boulder on the ranch. The rescue was swift and decisive. Jenkins's outnumbered and outmaneuvered men surrendered quickly, and Jenkins himself was dragged from the house, blustering and threatening legal action. And then Kieran was there, bursting through the door of her room, his face a mixture of relief and barely contained rage. "Maribelle," he breathed, crossing to her in 2 long strides. His arms came around her, holding her so tightly she could scarcely breathe, but she didn't care. She clung to him, the fear and tension of the past day and night finally giving way to tears. "Are you hurt?" he asked, drawing back to examine her face, her bound wrists, his eyes dark with concern and anger. She shook her head, then gestured to her wrists. Kieran quickly cut the ropes, his touch gentle as he examined the raw skin beneath. "Jenkins will pay for this," he promised, his voice low and dangerous. "The law might move slowly, but I won't let him get away with hurting you." Maribelle placed her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. Slowly, deliberately, she signed, "No violence, justice, not vengeance." His expression softened slightly. "You're a better person than I am, Maribelle Nolan," he sighed. "But you're right, we'll do this legally. Jenkins will face charges for kidnapping, and that should be enough to settle the water dispute in our favor as well." She nodded, then signed, "Take me home." The aftermath of the kidnapping brought changes to Chisholm Ranch and the Quinn Ranch alike. Jenkins was arrested and held for trial, his ranch placed under the management of his foreman. The territorial judge, alerted to the seriousness of the situation, expedited his visit to the region, arriving within a week to hear both the criminal case against Jenkins and the water rights dispute. Maribelle's testimony, given through written statements and Kieran's interpretation of her signs, was pivotal in both hearings. Jenkins was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for kidnapping, and the water rights were officially adjudicated in Kieran's favor. "It's over," Kieran told Maribelle as they rode back to the ranch after the final hearing. "We can move forward now." Move forward they did, With Jenkins's threat removed, they focused on their upcoming wedding. Maribel's mother and sister arrived from Boston 2 weeks before the ceremony, full of curiosity about the life she had built in Montana and the man she had chosen to share it with. "I must admit," her mother confessed after several days at the ranch, "when I received your letter about the fire and your condition, I feared the worst. I imagined you living in isolation, dependent on charity." She glanced toward the window, where Kieran could be seen in the yard, discussing something with Mr. Brooks. "I never imagined you would find such purpose and such love in this wilderness." Maribel smiled, signing a response that her sister translated. "Sometimes we find our true selves in the most unexpected places." The wedding took place on a clear November day, the mountains dusted with the first snow of the season. The ceremony was held in the main house, which had been decorated with pine boughs and late-blooming wildflowers from the sheltered valleys nearby. The territorial judge who had settled their case against Jenkins officiated, having stayed on in the region at Kieran's invitation. Maribel wore a gown of ivory silk that her mother had brought from Boston, her hair adorned with a wreath of dried lavender and rosemary from her garden. Kieran, standing beside the judge in a new suit that still couldn't quite disguise the cowboy within, watched her approach with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the female guests were seen to dab at their eyes. The vows were simple, Kieran speaking his aloud, Maribel signing hers with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. When it came time for the exchange of rings, Kieran surprised her by signing his response. "With this ring, I thee wed," his fingers moving confidently through the gestures they had practiced together. The judge pronounced them husband and wife, and Kieran gathered Maribel into his arms for a kiss that prompted cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration continued well into the night, with dancing, feasting, and more than a few toasts to the couple's happiness. As the hour grew late, they slipped away from the festivities to the main house, now their shared home, leaving their guests to continue the revelry in the decorated barn. "Mrs. Quinn," Kieran said as he carried her over the threshold, testing the new name with evident pleasure. Maribel smiled, signing. "I like the sound of that, even though you can't hear it," he teased gently. She reached up to touch his face, her expression growing serious as she signed. "I hear it in my heart." Spring came early to Montana in 1877, bringing new growth to the Quinn Ranch. The cattle thrived under Kieran's management. The accounts flourished under Maribel's careful stewardship, and their partnership, both personal and professional, deepened with each passing day. In April, as the first wildflowers bloomed along the creek banks, Maribel confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting a child. She shared the news with Kieran one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. His joy was boundless, his concern for her equally so. "Are you happy about this?" he asked, searching her face. "Truly," she nodded emphatically, then signed. "I never thought I would have this: a husband, a home, a child. After the fire, I believed that part of my life was over." Kieran drew her close, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "You'll be a wonderful mother," he assured her, "and our child will be the most fortunate in the territory to have you guiding them." Maribel leaned into his embrace, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fire that had taken her voice had seemed like an ending, the death of her dreams, her independence, her future. Instead, it had been a beginning, opening a path to a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. As the months passed and her body changed, Maribel found herself wondering about the child growing within her. Would it be a boy with Kieran's steady gaze and quiet strength? a girl with her own love of books and learning. And would her inability to speak allowed impact her ability to mother this child? Kieran, sensing her concerns, brought home books on child development and language acquisition. Together, they researched how children learn to communicate, discovering that speech was only one component of the complex process, that touch, facial expressions, and gestures were equally important in the early years. Besides, he told her one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on the swell of her abdomen where their child grew, our baby will grow up learning 2 languages from the start, spoken and signed. That's a gift, not a disadvantage. His certainty comforted her, as did the quiet preparations they made together for the baby's arrival, converting a room adjacent to theirs into a nursery, sewing tiny garments, crafting a cradle from pine harvested on their own land. In December, as the first heavy snows of winter blanketed the ranch, Maribelle went into labor. The ranch hands rode for the doctor in Chisholm Ranch, but the weather slowed his journey, and it was Mrs. Brooks who attended the birth, her capable hands and calm demeanor guiding Maribelle through the long, difficult hours. Kieran remained by her side throughout, his face pale with concern but his voice steady as he encouraged her, interpreted her signed requests, and cooled her brow with damp cloths. Shortly after midnight, their son was born, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's determined chin. When the doctor finally arrived, he pronounced both mother and child in excellent condition, complimenting Mrs. Brooks on her midwifery skills. Later, as dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Maribelle sat propped against pillows in their bed, the baby nestled in her arms. Kieran sat beside them, his expression one of wonder as he counted the tiny fingers and toes of his son for the 3rd time. "He's perfect," he said softly. "Absolutely perfect. What shall we call him?" Maribelle considered for a moment, then signed one-handed, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. "James, after my father." "James Quinn," Kieran tested the name, nodding his approval. "A strong name for a strong boy." Looking down at the child in her arms, Maribelle felt a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This was her son, hers and Kieran's. A new life they had created together, full of promise and possibility. As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran leaned forward to kiss her forehead. "He'll never know anything but love," he promised. "And he'll grow up understanding the true meaning of courage because he'll see it in his mother every day." Maribelle signed with her free hand. "And integrity, because he'll see it in his father." Together, they watched as James Quinn slept peacefully, unaware of the journey that had brought his parents together, the challenges they had overcome, the love that had flourished in the most unlikely circumstances. Outside, the Montana winter wrapped the ranch in its icy embrace, but within the walls of the Quinn home, all was warmth and hope and new beginnings. 5 years later, on the anniversary of the schoolhouse fire, Maribelle stood on the porch of the main house, watching as Kieran taught James to ride his pony in the yard. At 5, the boy was a miniature version of his father, the same serious expression when concentrating, the same quick smile when pleased. Beside Maribelle, 3-year-old Margaret, named for Kieran's mother, played with a set of wooden blocks, her dark curls bouncing as she stacked them carefully, her small hands occasionally moving in the signs she had learned alongside her spoken words. The ranch had prospered in the years since their marriage. The herd had doubled in size, and Kieran's reputation as a fair and knowledgeable cattleman had spread throughout the territory. Maribelle's financial management had been instrumental in their success, her keen mind for figures and planning complementing Kieran's practical knowledge of the land and the cattle. But their greatest success, Maribelle reflected as she watched her family, had nothing to do with cattle or profit. It was the life they had built together, a life founded on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love that had grown deeper with each passing year. James, completing a successful circuit of the yard on his pony, looked up at her with a triumphant smile. "Did you see, Mama?" he called. "I did it all by myself," Maribelle nodded, her hands moving in the signs that were as natural to her now as breathing. "I saw. You're becoming a fine horseman just like your father." James's hands moved in response. Signing had been his first language, mastered before speech, and he switched between the two with ease. "Can I ride to the creek today? Pa promised to show me where the best fishing spots are." "After lunch," Kieran answered for her, lifting the boy down from the pony. "Your mama has something special planned for this afternoon, remember." James's face lit up. "The new school. Are we going now?" "Soon," Maribelle signed. "Go wash up for lunch first." As the children hurried inside, Kieran came to join Maribelle on the porch, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "Are you ready for this?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her stomach fluttered with nervous anticipation. Today marked the opening of the new Chisholm Ranch School for the deaf, a project she had conceived, and Kieran had enthusiastically supported. Using part of the ranch's profits and donations from townspeople, they had built a small schoolhouse specifically designed for teaching children who, like Maribelle, could not hear or speak. There were only 4 students enrolled so far, children from surrounding ranches and towns, who had previously had no access to education. But it was a beginning, and Maribelle had spent months preparing teaching materials and methods based on the sign language she and Kieran had developed together, supplemented by books and correspondence with schools for the deaf in the East. "They're lucky children," Kieran said, watching her face. "To have you as their teacher." Maribelle smiled, signing. "I'm the lucky one, to have this second chance." That afternoon, as she stood before her small class in the bright, airy schoolhouse, Maribelle felt the circle of her life complete itself. The fire had taken her voice, but given her a new path, one that had led to Kieran, to their children, and now to this opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others like herself. As her hands moved, forming the signs that would open doors of communication and learning for these children, she caught Kieran's eye where he stood at the back of the room, James and Margaret beside him. His smile held all the love and pride and partnership that had sustained her through the past 5 years. In that moment, Maribelle knew with absolute certainty that losing her voice had not silenced her. It had simply taught her, and those who loved her, to listen in new ways. And in that listening, they had all found a deeper, truer voice than she had ever possessed before. The woman who had lost her voice saving children from a fire had found something far more precious, a life where silence was not emptiness but another form of music, where hands could speak as eloquently as lips, and where love transcended all barriers of communication. As the lesson continued, and the children's hands began to move in response to hers, Maribelle's heart was full. The journey had been hard, the path unexpected, but she wouldn't have changed a single step that had brought her here, to this classroom, to this ranch, to the family that was her greatest joy and proudest accomplishment. Outside the schoolhouse window, Montana stretched away in all its wild beauty. Inside, a new future was taking shape, word by word, sign by sign, heart to heart.